Chapter 9, Feminist Economics. Feminist economics is not just economics that considers gender issues. In fact, that's not even necessary. Rather, while it was originally inspired by an attempt to explain the lot of women, and though that continues to be a major focus, feminist economics has evolved into a unique philosophical and analytical approach that can be applied to any issue. Researchers in this area draw from a number of paradigms. This is so because, quote, the intellectual groundwork was established by scholars working in neoclassical economics, institutional economics, and Marxist political economy, unquote. And though no community of scholars is completely homogeneous, it should be clear from the earlier chapters that the differences among these approaches can be quite significant. This makes feminist economics a particularly interesting study, especially in a volume that argues that pluralistic approaches are more likely to generate useful and reliable explanations. No other paradigm in this book reaches more broadly across the spectrum for its inspiration. Section title, Economics for What? Feminist economics asks some very fundamental questions about our discipline. What, for example, does it mean to practice economics? Is it, as maintained by many in the mainstream, the description of objective facts and the value-free analysis of the way the world is? Or does it require subjective interpretations of what we observe, followed by normative recommendations of changes that we believe will improve people's lives? Feminists say the answer is clearly the latter. Even those economists who claim to be doing the former are, in fact, making value judgments. Because there cannot be a view except from a viewpoint, all theories and models are necessarily based on ideological and philosophical assumptions that directly affect their analyses and policy recommendations. Those who argue that economics is a coldly rational institution, slowly replacing ignorance with knowledge, are epistemologically ignorant. It is a social process that is embedded within a particular culture and is therefore subject to all the same biases and limitations as the people conducting it. Delving deeper, if, as feminist economists argue, an integral part of doing economics is recommending policy to improve people's lives, then we need a means of measuring economic well-being. While economists of every variety would concede that this is a complex question, most would likely point to GDP as a reasonable choice. Defined as the dollar value of all goods and services produced and sold within a country in a given time period, it is widely considered to be one of the most important measures of aggregate economic activity and a natural focal point for policy recommendations. Raising GDP should, ceteris paribus, raise people's happiness. But herein lies another fundamental objection from the feminist school of thought. While definitions and statistical categories may seem to be neutral constructions, they are most certainly not. How we decide to categorize people, things, and activities is, consistent with the discussion above, value-laden. It reflects what distinctions we think are important and which activities are worthy of study. Take race, for example. This is not a scientific category, but a social one. It classifies people by characteristics that are significant only because a particular society has decided they are. Ironically, this subjectivity does not make race unimportant. Quite the opposite. Such characterizations operate to define reality for us. For good or bad, they say who you are, determine how others view you, and define your role in society. Not surprisingly, feminists see gender classifications in this same light. What we decide is feminine or masculine is socially constructed and varies across time and space. Even the categories themselves vary, as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered are gaining acceptance over the simple binary male-female. And yet, despite their lack of scientific validity, these definitions play a crucial role in how we live our lives and in how we view ourselves and others. They reflect and reinforce social roles and power relationships. The subjectivity and cultural relativity of definitions like race and gender is easy to see. What is more subtle is the impact of abstract theoretical constructs like GDP. Since we cannot look at everything at once, these offer important focal points. But because such categories do not exist in nature, they too are reflective of social choices. The phenomena they illuminate are those we deem sufficiently important to expend resources in studying. Anything we deem uninteresting or insignificant goes uncounted. With that in mind, consider the following with respect to GDP. Our most popular measure of economic activity and well-being totally ignores non-market acts like home management and child rearing that are often the near exclusive domain of women. This is despite the fact that unpaid labor in the home, caring labor, is of major significance to the economy. It underpins the ability of people to provide labor to the paid economy and is an essential component of the development of future citizens, workers, and taxpayers. This is not, according to feminist economists, a minor oversight that could be corrected with a footnote or a dummy variable, but a reflection of a deep-seated cultural bias. It is rooted in the belief that activities traditionally undertaken by men are more important than those performed by women. The importance of this goes beyond economic theory. Consider the impact of using GDP as a gauge of prosperity. This implies, for example, that it is more socially valuable for a single mother or father to take a low-wage, dead-end job than concentrate on the extremely hard work of teaching a child discipline, self-worth, and respect for others. Indeed, those opting for the latter, particularly when they fall into certain racial categories, may be condemned as parasites and accused of living off the labor of others. This characterization has affected policy. In the United States, for example, one of the reasons public assistance has become increasingly difficult to obtain since the 1980s is the widespread belief that home work is less valuable than market work. Measures like GDP mean that economic theory operates to support this perspective, subtly but decisively. The definition of GDP is particularly problematic in developing nations where the power differential between men and women is often the greatest. Not only may attempts to raise the nation's GDP pull men away from those aspects of home management and child-rearing jobs where they had once assisted, thereby reducing the quantity and quality of those activities, but it is unlikely that women will be permitted to share in the income and property earned as a result of the market-based activities. Thus, while we pat ourselves on the back for the wonderful job we have done in raising GDP in the developing world, women are often finding themselves in worse shape than when we started. A different definition of economic well-being might well lead to different policies and results. Many economists might interject here that while caring labor is obviously important, the problem is that it is more properly the study of sociologists and social workers. It fails a primary standard of behavior, that is, it is not economics. But if our discipline focuses only on market-based activities, then we have to concede that the overwhelming majority of human history has no economic significance. Except for trivialities or dubious analogies, our tools of analysis would be useless in studying feudalism, the Roman Empire, subsistence farming, or the Aztecs. Surely no one thinks that's true. Rather, our focus on markets over non-market activity is ideological and cultural, a function of the implicit assumption that what women do is less valuable. These biases go beyond definitions and statistical categories. The very tools of modern neoclassical economics are rooted in processes that reflect the social conception of maleness, such as competition, exploit, and survival of the fittest. In this manner, our discipline becomes one of the many means by which we are taught that masculinity is superior to femininity. Nor is its influence minor, and here's an extended quote from Barker. The discursive power of economics is not to be underestimated. Economics, particularly neoclassical economics, the type of analyses taught in most undergraduate economics courses, extolled in publications such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and lauded by national and international politicians and policymakers, is widely considered to be objective, gender-neutral, and value-free. Its pronouncements are couched in the same terms as natural laws, and the laws of supply and demand are accorded the same status as the law of gravity. The scientific status of economics depends crucially on its methods of inquiry, methodological individualism, rational choice theory, and mathematical modeling. That ends the quote. These theories, say feminists, are far from objective, gender-neutral, and value-free. However, those who benefit from the power relations these theories justify have every reason to argue otherwise. It allows them to offer a supposedly scientific justification for the underrepresentation of women and other disadvantaged groups in certain jobs, the existence of wage differentials, and the inferior status of home or caring work. As it stands, The bulk of the economics discipline is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Feminist economics is, therefore, an approach that asks us to carefully consider the impact of culture not simply on the economy, but on economics. Science is conducted by people who are members of particular social groups. These groups have implicit and explicit views of justice, religion, politics, nature, kinship patterns, race, gender, and so on. Feminists argue that all of these have a major impact on how we do economics. They shape definitions, theories, the manner in which processes are modeled, and so on. And if we disagree with some of the values imported from the broader culture, then it may not be enough to tweak the analysis by shifting a curve to the left instead of the right. You might have to change economics itself. This is precisely what the feminists are arguing. They disagree with the inferior status assigned to femininity by society at large and subsequently reflected in economics. Many existing tools of analysis are therefore useless in addressing this inequity because they implicitly embrace it. If we are to improve the lot of those we study, then we must develop an alternative economics. Next section, paradigmatic approaches to feminist economics. But what that alternative should be varies somewhat and is affected by the school or schools of thought influencing the researcher in question. As mentioned in the opening of this chapter, feminist economics draws from three disparate groups: neoclassicism, Marxism, and institutionalism. While to some extent pluralistic and even interdisciplinary work is encouraged, there's also elements of each of the three that are mutually exclusive. Neoclassicism's focus on the rational individual with independent preferences, for example, clashes at a very fundamental level with institutionalism's core concepts of culture and value. Thus, while one could draw selectively from neoclassicism, Marxism, and institutionalism to build a coherent feminist alternative to the mainstream economics, it would not be possible to simply combine all three. For that reason, this section is divided into three subsections: neoclassical influences, Marxist influences, and institutionalist influences. In each, the elements upon which feminists have drawn or rejected will be highlighted. This does not mean that everyone uses all these, but then the general methodology of feminism is one that encourages creativity and experimentation. By this pluralistic approach, they hope to avoid the fundamental errors they perceive in other approaches. First of the three sections is neoclassical influences. The majority of economists are neoclassical, and almost everyone was at least trained in this tradition, even if they later chose another route. As explained in Chapter 3, among the core concepts in neoclassicism are that economic agents are rational and that market systems tend to generate optimal outcomes, wherein wages, incomes, and profits are a function of objectively determined contributions to national wealth. It is possible even within neoclassicism to take issue with these, but as they are the default beliefs, one must be prepared to spend considerable time and effort in defending any alternate premises. Such violations of secondary standards of behavior carry considerable risk, especially when one considers that being ostracized from neoclassicism also means losing out on access to what is by far the largest share of resources in our discipline. That said, it's very difficult to build a feminist alternative without rejecting those concepts, for they exhibit the very same male biases from which they are trying to escape. To demonstrate the difficulties involved, let us examine the work of someone who tried to explain gender issues without rejecting those premises, Gary Becker. While he was not a feminist economist, he was a very important and well-known figure in our discipline, and the criticisms to which his work is subjected by feminists are instructive. Gary Becker's study of the family assumes a standard neoclassical model about which he writes in the introduction to A Treatise on the Family, and here's an extended quote from Gary Becker. It, neoclassical economics, now assumes that individuals maximize their utility from basic preferences that do not change rapidly over time, and that the behavior of different individuals is coordinated by explicit and implicit markets. This volume uses the assumptions of maximizing behavior, stable preferences, and equilibrium in implicit or explicit markets to provide a systematic analysis of the family. I build on my research during the last decade to analyze the allocation of time to children and to market work, marriage and divorce in polygamous as well as monogamous societies, altruism in addition to selfishness in families, intergenerational mobility, and many other aspects of the family. And that ends the quote from Becker. Gary Becker's work is considered classic within neoclassicism, and he earned the 1992 Nobel Prize in Economics for having extended the domain of microeconomic analysis to a wide range of human behavior and interaction, including non-market behavior. An example of his neoclassically based analysis of gender issues is his examination of the differential between men's and women's wages. He argues that even taking into account various other factors, one may still be left with a residual between what a male and female worker is paid. But Becker does not assume that discrimination is occurring in the workplace. He argues instead that this same outcome is consistent with A, increasing returns to investments in human capital, B, women having the greater responsibility, for whatever reason, for child rearing and home maintenance, and C, the fact that child rearing and home maintenance are more tiring than leisure. The first says that the more time spent at a particular market job raises one's productivity in that employment and hence one's wage. If women spend less time than men outside the home, they will logically be relatively less skilled. The second and third imply that if men are choosing only between labor and leisure, while women have the added responsibility of home maintenance and child rearing, then women probably have less energy remaining for any market work they may undertake. They therefore voluntarily seek less demanding, lower paying work, and any human capital or experience that they build up at all, which again is likely to be less than that of their husbands, will be in jobs with poor pay and benefits. And this is why men get paid more than women. The freely chosen division of labor in the home creates the economically fair wage differential we observe in the workplace. As he says, quote, housework responsibilities lower the earnings and affect the jobs of married women by reducing their time in the labor force and discouraging their investment in market human capital, end of the quote. But why, say feminists, should a gender-based allocation of labor exist in the first place? For this is obviously a key question. One of the possibilities suggested by Becker is that it is based on natural ability and the consequent comparative advantages. Women do homework because they're better at it. Critics argue, however, that he is engaging in circular logic. It is obvious that women are better at housework because they specialize in it, and they specialize in it because they're better at it. Furthermore, this explanation is premised on the idea that all agents have an equal say in how household resources are managed, or that everyone is truly free to choose. Therefore, the consequent allocations must be optimal, because if they were not, people would not have selected them. Some have openly suggested that this is a result of the arrogant male belief that if they, the men, are happy, then the arrangement must be fair. Even when Becker allows for the possibility that there might be discrimination in the household, that is, that men are forcing women into the homemaker role, he suggests that it's in the best interest of the utility-maximizing husband to make the most efficient choice. Any way you cut it, from Becker's and neoclassicism's perspective, the allocation of household labor must be optimal. Another criticism raised is that Becker's approach discounts the possibility that home work is marketable. Surely the ability to cook, clean, raise children, and otherwise manage a household is something that could be translated into income. Indeed, there are market equivalents of all these tasks. Why, then, are even homebound women not developing saleable skills? That this is not even considered, they say, is further evidence of the masculinist bias of economics. The real reason those undertakings pay less is because they're associated with women's work. The bottom line is that, according to feminists, it's impossible to explain the lot of women using the standard neoclassical model. The latter was built on the implicit assumption that the status quo was objectively fair, and its definitions, theories, and models reflect this. It served to justify and perpetuate the existing social hierarchy, just as the divine right of kings justified the status of the feudal serf. It is impossible to use the former to emancipate the latter. This is not to say that all of neoclassicism must be rejected, and indeed there are neoclassically inspired feminist works. Concepts like formal and informal markets, maximizing behavior, stable preferences, and equilibrium can be employed, but not without allowing for the possibility of discrimination, power differentials, and suboptimal outcomes. To feminist economists, the existence of inequities is not an open question, but an empirical fact, and one that demands explanation. Next section, second of three, Marxist influences. At the end of the day, however, neoclassicism is poorly equipped to answer the real key question, that is, the ultimate source of the discrimination against women. For that reason, those seeking answers have wandered outside of both neoclassicism and economics. One would think that Marxism might be useful in this regard. After all, while mainstream economics suggests that any outcomes generated by the free market must be fair, one of the core premises of Marxism is that the gross inequities are an inevitable feature of capitalism. And indeed, this observation is not without merit. However, because Marxism's theory of discrimination arose from different concerns and antedated the feminist movement, its basis is not gender but class. Furthermore, class was hardly a secondary concept for Marx, so it cannot be easily subordinated. Not only is it the source of the core injustice in the system, it plays a central role in the contradictions that emerge. One cannot therefore simply replace workers with women and tell the same story. That feminist issues are often subsumed under class ones is obviously unacceptable to those who are more concerned with gender inequities. In addition, some feminists have accused Marxism of the same oversights as neoclassicism. For example, and here's a quote from Howard and King, "Feminists complain with considerable justice that Marx's value theory degrades women's domestic labor by categorizing it as useful but unproductive. Useful because it is essential for the reproduction of the capitalist mode of production itself, unproductive since it produces neither commodities nor value nor surplus value." End of the quote. Last, just as neoclassicism employs statistical categories that downplay traditionally female activities, so the very basis of Marxist exploitation theory falls into the same trap, because it is based on wage labor and the generation of a surplus that is retained by the capitalist. By this definition, those not doing wage labor cannot be exploited. Nevertheless, many feminists are attracted to the Marxist and more broadly socialist theory. It does at least allow for the existence of oppression, alienation, and significant power differentials in a way that neoclassicism does not. And just because traditional Marxism is based on class and market transactions does not mean that modern studies must also be. Indeed, a number of feminists have adopted Marxist historical dialectic as a tool of analysis. Particularly appealing are the ideas that human behavior is a function of their institutional and material circumstances and that society evolves. Marx's view that humans should be free to control their own destinies and to develop the skills they choose while cooperating with rather than competing against their sibling workers also rings true. Still, the marriage between Marxism and feminism has been a rocky one. Third of the three subsections, institutionalist influences. What appears to have been a more harmonious combination has been that between feminism and institutionalism. This is not surprising given the fact that the founder of the latter, Thorstein Veblen, was deeply interested in gender issues. Recall from Chapter 7 that institutionalists argue that Homo sapiens are social animals, and as such, they instinctively seek out tribal membership. Membership is a function of shared beliefs, practices, valuation systems, and so on. In terms of the last, institutionalists argue that two basic evaluative criteria exist: ceremonial and instrumental. Ceremonial values are past binding and oriented towards defining status. Behaviors sanctioned by ceremony derive their legitimacy not from logic or experimentation, but from authority, and they tend to be exploitative in the sense that they encourage actions that expropriate rather than build. Meanwhile, instrumentally warranted behavior is goal-oriented and experimental and is democratically based. Propriety is a function of one's success in achieving the end in question, and actions are more commonly associated with industriousness and nurturing. These are reflected in Veblen's writing on gender. Parentheses, note that the, quote, two sets of human activities, unquote, referenced below are directly related to ceremony and instrumentality. I'm about to give you a quote from Bill Duggar. According to Veblen, two sets of human activities and their corresponding values, beliefs, and meanings form the point and counterpoint of human existence. On one hand is male personal exploit, and then the other is female social industry. Male exploit is aimed at seizure of wealth, ownership, capture of slaves and servants, or ownership and marriage, and the display of status, conspicuous consumption, and conspicuous leisure. Female industry is aimed at production of serviceable items, the instinct of workmanship, care of children and the infirm, parental bent, and the increase in sharing of arts and crafts, idle curiosity. That's the end of the quote from Bill Duggar. Thus, modern institutionalists see their school of thought as offering more fertile ground for feminist economics than either of the other two paradigms discussed so far in this chapter. Gender discrimination is not seen as derivative of class, as in Marxism, nor a function of some unexplained personal taste, as in neoclassicism. Instead, institutionalism emphasizes the role of cultural myth. The inferiority of women in our society, they argue, has its roots in our shared cultural beliefs that have been passed down from generation to generation and, under most circumstances, accepted without question, even by women. To institutionalism, sexism is a ceremonial value that creates an invidious distinction. Men are more important than women. According to Veblen, this value originated around 10,000 years ago as we transitioned from hunter-gatherer society to permanent settlements with domesticated animals, agriculture, and an increasing number of tools. This created the possibility of a predatory life whereby one group supported itself by taking the food, tools, homes, animals, people, and so on of others. In such societies, and in those where they are forced to defend themselves, and here's a quote from Veblen, the group divides itself conventionally into a fighting and a peacekeeping class with a corresponding division of labor. Fighting, together with other work that involves a serious element of exploit, becomes the employment of the able-bodied men. The uneventful everyday work of the group falls to the women and the infirm. That's the end of the quote from Thorstein Veblen. The reason for the division of labor is simple. Men, on average, are physically stronger than women. This does not, in and of itself, suggest that a value should evolve that implies that women are inferior, but it is not difficult to imagine. Even without the development of predatory lifestyles, brute strength favors men. Institutionalists believe that this invidious distinction survived primitive society. Indeed, those in power had little incentive to see it end. Even today, male is the default standard, while female is an inferior version of male. William Duggar writes of women, if she likes to climb trees when a girl, then it's because she's a tomboy. If a boy likes to climb trees, no questions are asked and no answers must be given. While a young man who likes to paint nude women has no explaining to do, a young woman who likes to paint nude men has quite a lot of explaining to do. She must explain why she is not merely sublimating her alleged desire to be a man. While a young man struggling to advance his professional career has no explaining to do, a young woman doing the same has quite a lot of explaining to do. She must explain why she is putting off having children, and so on and on. That's the end of the quote from Bill Duggar. This, say institutionalists, is the reason why women find themselves with lower wages and less control over family assets, excluded from positions of economic power, and so on. Traditionally, female-dominated jobs earn less respect, and while women in male jobs are sometimes looked upon as having been successful despite their gender, men in women's jobs are viewed with suspicion. As Veblen wrote over 100 years ago, one of the early consequences of this deprecation of infirmity is a taboo on women and women's employments. In this apprehension of the archaic animistic barbarian, infirmity is infectious. The infection may work its mischievous effect both by sympathetic influence and by transfusion. Therefore, it is well for the able-bodied man who is mindful of his virility to shun all undue contact and conversation with the weaker sex and to avoid all contamination with the employments that are characteristic of the sex. Even the habitual food of women should not be eaten by men, lest their force be thereby impaired. The injunction against womanly employments and foods and against intercourse with women applies with special rigor during the season of preparation for any work of manly exploit, such as the great hunt or a warlike raid, or induction into some manly dignity or society or mystery. Illustrations of this seasonal taboo abound in early history of all peoples that have had a warlike or barbarian past. That's the end of the quote. Although Veblen was hopeful that this value was breaking down, institutionalists say elements of these taboos are still evident today. Institutionalism thereby offers feminism a framework within which to understand the social status of women. Next section, method. A key starting point for feminist methodology is their contention that economics is not and cannot be value-free. Science is always embedded in the larger culture such that those conducting it are affected by the values they carry with them. The consequent masculinist bias of economics has meant that our discipline operates as an intellectual justification for the inferior status of women and other disadvantaged groups. This is not specific to economics, but a function of broader social values. Feminist researchers are therefore very sensitive to the fact that all definitions, models, and theories are value-laden. This is unavoidable, but by openly recognizing this, we become more cognizant of the strengths and weaknesses of our work and are thus more able to create realistic analyses. Within that general context, feminist economists draw from a number of intellectual traditions, both in economics and beyond, in undertaking their studies. They embrace this pluralistic approach as consistent with the broader philosophy above. In addition, the fact that existing economic schools of thought have been impacted by the very biases feminists hope to avoid means that as a practical matter, one is forced to pick and choose among them in order to find elements that can be salvaged or adapted. If some parts of neoclassicism, Marxism, and institutionalism turn out to be useful and can be integrated into a new and more illuminating explanation, then this is what should be done. Such an approach is encouraged by feminists. Next section, views of human nature and justice. Feminist economists believe that Homo sapiens are social animals and that cultural factors are therefore important determinants of behavior. The inferior status of women, for example, is not a function of nature or objective processes, it's learned. It is impossible to understand the factors affecting economic well-being or to recommend policy if this is ignored. In terms of justice, feminist economists argue that people of every gender and ethnicity should be free to make their own choices. That this is often prevented by legal and social factors means that, for feminists, proposals must by necessity range well outside traditional categories like monetary and fiscal policy. There is no other way to improve the lot of women and other disadvantaged groups. Empowering people is every bit as, if not more, important than lowering unemployment or inflation. Standards of behavior, primary. One cannot really be a feminist economist and believe that existing economic and social differences between men and women are natural or objectively determined. Nor is it likely that rejecting the idea that power is an important consideration would be acceptable. Last, that economics is necessarily value-laden and that a key part of our undertaking is to recommend policy to better people's lives are both important elements of feminism. Secondary standards of behavior. All that said, the pluralistic and interdisciplinary nature of feminist economics leaves the researcher with a great deal of latitude outside these primary standards. Their openness means that not only would works containing elements of neoclassicism, Marxism, institutionalism be potentially acceptable, but that those drawing from sociology, political science, literature, and so on, and various strands therein will also be welcome. Popular research themes in feminist economics include development, history, methodology, and non-market activity. Next section, contemporary activities. The primary group for feminist and gender economists is the International Association for Feminist Economists. Their webpage advertises a number of activities. Organization of an annual conference to present current research, plan future research, and interact with economists and advocates with similar interests. Organization of sessions at national, regional, and international meetings of economists. Publication of a newsletter that reports on activities, opportunities, and resources of interest. Maintenance of an electronic mail network to provide quick and low-cost communication among subscribers interested in feminist economics. Compilation of bibliographies, course syllabi, and a list of working papers on feminist economics. Publication of a scholarly journal, Feminist Economics, to increase awareness of feminist research in economics. Feminist economics is a very active area, and one will find papers and presentations outside of journals and conferences that are self-consciously focused on gender issues. Criticisms. Some of the work done by feminists would no doubt be viewed as better suited to sociology or history, particularly by neoclassical economists. It is not so much that it's not worthwhile, it's just not economics. In addition, mainstream economists generally view approaches that eschew complex mathematical modeling as soft, meaning that they lack the rigor and reliability of real science. Feminist economics certainly falls into this category. Final rejoinder. The argument against ignoring non-market work in economics was already made above, but the gist of it is that if our discipline is about the determinants of the material well-being of humans, it makes no sense to ignore the contribution of a large percentage of Homo sapiens just because they did not sell their services. Not only do markets exist for many of these activities, but even if they were of no value in and of themselves, which is certainly not the case, they support our ability to carry out market transactions. Caring labor creates market labor. Even more troubling to feminists is the idea that we should differentiate between market and non-market labor at all. This, they say, is again derivative of the masculinist bias in our culture and discipline. Likewise, the view that abstract rational math is somehow superior to other forms of modeling, pattern modeling, storytelling, history, case study, participant observer, and so on, is also flawed. What tool we employ should be a function of what would best answer the question at hand, not what is viewed as the most difficult to master. The latter is a result of male competitiveness. In point of fact, say feminists, a great deal of human behavior is too complex to reduce to a set of simultaneous equations, so that when we force our studies into these restrictive and overly rigid formats, we actually obscure rather than illuminate. Economists' obsession with advanced mathematics is a function of masculine posturing, not careful methodology. Further reading. There are a number of excellent collections and general guides. For example, the Elgar Companion to Feminist Economics, while older, offers not only an encyclopedic treatment of the topic that is not limited to any particular school of thought, but vital references for each. The Economics of the Family covers neoclassical and institutionalist contributions, and both Beyond Economic Man and Feminist Economics Today are also useful collections. The journal Feminist Economics has many articles that are non-technical and accessible. Finally, although there are many feminist blogs, only a few focus on economics per se. Lady Economist is probably the best and is quite active. That was Chapter 9. Thank you.